So guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're going to be talking about mental toughness and what exactly that means and why you need it with your running. I guess we're also going to find out how you can become more mentally tough. But first, this is the weekly running and training vlog where the main purpose of this video is for you to tell me about your week of running. I want to hear about your successes and I definitely want to hear about those setbacks. Oh, and while you're in the comments letting me know about your week of running, I also want to know about your mental toughness. Do you think you are mentally tough? How do you deal with those hard situations when you're out running and you just don't want to continue? Or let's say you're in a race and you're really digging deep. Do you have any tips to share? I'd love to hear about it. Let me know in the comments. Okay, so I did come across an article in the MIT Press Reader, and the article is titled Running and the Science of Mental Toughness. And it is a fairly long article, but I will provide a link in the show notes below, and it talks about several different studies that have tested endurance and mental toughness. So if you don't want to read the whole article, don't worry, I will summarize. So the thing about mental toughness is that it really doesn't have a concrete definition. It's more of an abstract concept. And what makes it even more abstract is that it actually changes for each of us, depending on different things. Well, listen, I don't want to say it changes for you. Mental toughness changes for me. Some days I can actually feel pretty mentally tough, and I can dig deep, and I can keep going even when I don't want to. But there are other days when it's a bit more of a challenge, and I just feel like packing it in. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But however we define mental toughness, it ultimately comes down to self-regulation. How are we able to regulate our feelings, our emotions, and do we persevere in the face of negative feelings or negative emotions? So there are actually two kinds of self-regulation. The first is self-regulated learning. And self-regulated learning is when you actually take control of your own developmental process and you take every opportunity to get out there, to get better. And I know that you and I do this, we do this on a daily basis, or maybe not every day, but several times a week. It's those times when we really don't feel like going out for a run, but we know that we will feel like it after the run gets going. We kind of overcome the hurdle of not wanting to do it. And it's not just getting out there and doing it when we don't feel like it. It's going out and running a hilly route rather than staying on the flat land. It's running intervals when you would rather just run easy. It's going out and knocking out a training session after a hard day at work or after you've had a bad night's sleep or limited sleep. The second kind of self-regulation is how we take care of our emotions. And my first thought was that this was much more important than the first one, but honestly, I'd say they're equal. If we control our emotions, it's really nothing if we don't make ourselves get out and go for that run. So controlling our emotions is all about controlling those thoughts and our actions that are spurred by those thoughts and keeping them in line with our goals. And I'm going to assume that you guys have goals of some kind. It's very difficult to do anything without a goal. And that goal could be a race in the future, or it could just be to run consistently. So the article points out that self-regulation is probably an individual trait, and we both know this. There are some people that just are better at controlling their emotions. There are some people that are better at getting out there even when they don't want to. But even if you and I are the type of person that isn't very good at self-regulation, it is something that we can learn. And how you learn self-regulation is by actively seeking out situations that force you to confront your own thoughts and emotions. And I realize that this is actually coming full circle, because if you don't feel like getting out and doing something, it's very difficult to go out to actively confront it. But that's the key. You just have to have that spark of motivation to get going and do something difficult. Do something that you don't want to do in the moment. And apparently it gets easier. Well, not apparently. I can speak for me, and I know that it does get easier. I've said this before on the channel, but it's a very rare time when I actually feel like going for a run when I set out for my run. But I know that it's only going to take a few minutes before I really do feel like running. Okay, so I think that is a really good point. We know we have to practice hard things in order to be able to do hard things, right? We have to run when we don't feel like it in order to understand and break through those hard times in our runs, because they will come. And also, when you get to that point in your run where you just have to stop, and maybe it's in a race, maybe it's in a training run, but that decision to stop has nothing to do with your muscles or your energy levels, and everything to do with your brain. In fact, the experts are pretty unanimous in that assertion that the brain controls physical exercise. And of course, you might be thinking, well, Matt, when I'm in a race, I'm pushing too hard, and then all of a sudden, perhaps my glycogen stores run out and I just don't have the physical energy to continue. Perhaps you're running so hard that your body just can't transport the oxygen to the muscles quick enough for you to keep going, right? Your body's just too tired. And perhaps that is true in a very limited number of cases. But for right now, we're talking about you and me and our normal daily runs and how it's difficult and how we want to stop. Because even though you may go out for a training run and you feel like you want to stop, telling you, it's very unlikely your body is out of energy or your muscles are just too tired to continue. And this was put to the test in 2010 with a study where 10 male athletes athletes, sorry ladies, went to a lab and they were asked to complete an endurance test. And during this endurance test, they were asked to pedal for as long as they could. Now, before the test started, the participants were asked to cycle for 5 seconds as hard as they could. Their power output was being measured. It was an explosive effort, everything they had for 5 seconds. After that explosive test, they then went on and they did the endurance test. And remember, the endurance test was to cycle for as long as they could. And the average time that these cyclists went for was 12 minutes. Now that doesn't seem like a lot of time. I was actually quite surprised to see it was only 12 minutes, but obviously the resistance was at such a level where 12 minutes of cycling was quite a challenge. But that in itself isn't very surprising. 12 minutes all out, yeah, I could see how I would be pretty tired after 12 minutes of cycling at an extremely heavy rate. What was fascinating though was after they did the cycling test to failure, they were then asked to do another 5-second explosive test. Now it's not going to be surprising that they weren't able to generate the same amount of power as they did in the first explosive 5-second test. But they were still able to generate over 3 times the power of their endurance test. And keep in mind, this was immediately after they had finished cycling to the point of failure. And this just supports the theory that when someone is exhausted, they still have plenty of energy left over. So keep that in mind for when you are feeling pretty tired out on your run. I guess ultimately what that study shows is that it isn't so much that tired muscles or a lack of energy is the problem. It's that they didn't have the motivation. So when we think about this endurance test, all the cyclists knew was that they had to pedal to failure. They didn't know when that endpoint was, they just had to go until they failed. But then all of a sudden, all they had to do was 5 seconds. So they had that clear endpoint in a very short space of time in order to put out that power. And because they had that endpoint, they were able to put out the power that was needed, even though just a few seconds before when they finished the endurance test, they weren't able to give anything else. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind when you only have a mile or 2 miles left. Me, it kind of reinforces the notion to break up your runs into shorter distances. If you're running a marathon or a half marathon, you can break it up into mile segments, right? All I have to do is get to the next mile. All I have to do is get to the next aid station. And that is a tried and true way to run further, to run faster. Okay, the next study that I want to tell you about that was mentioned in this article was testing the effects of mental fatigue on physical output. So before I tell you about it, I have another question for you. I want to know, do you think you have a mentally taxing life? And that could be your job, your family, anything at all that mentally taxes you. And maybe it's not all the time, maybe it's just once in a while, but when you are mentally fatigued, do you find it more difficult to go out for your run? So this next experiment was done in 2009 and it involved 16 participants. I don't know if they were male or female, but they were brought into a lab and they were asked to fill out a questionnaire about their mood at the moment. They were then separated into 2 groups. Now, one of the groups was asked to sit in a dark room where they had to complete a 90-minute computer assessment. And that computer assessment involved a lot of cognitive activity, which was designed to tax the brain, to be mentally fatiguing. The other group was a control group and they were asked to sit in a dark room and they watched a documentary about trains and cars. Clearly, that was not very mentally taxing, unless you really don't like trains or cars. But still, boredom is not mentally taxing. The participants then went on to the next stage of the experiment, which was a cycling test. And they were fitted out with a respiratory mask and electrodes to monitor their heart activity. And they were told to pedal as fast as they could until they could pedal no more. So again, we are going to exhaustion. But just in the name of time constraints, because this experiment couldn't go on for hours and hours and hours, they increased the resistance every 2 minutes. And just as a little prize to add a little motivation, they were going to reward the person who cycled the longest. There was a $50 prize purse. And during the actual cycling test, the participants were asked at regular intervals to rate their perceived exertion on a scale of 1 to 15. When the test was complete, they all filled out a questionnaire about their mood, and then a couple weeks later, they all came back to the lab, they reversed, and the participants that had to do the cognitive exercise now watched the documentary on cars and trains, and vice versa. And obviously, you know the results before I have to tell you, because I wouldn't be telling you about it if it wasn't a profound difference. But the participants that did the computer assessment that taxed their brain, that made them mentally tired, they reached their maximum level of effort much quicker than those that watched the documentary. Or I should say, those that weren't mentally fatigued, because that's actually what the experiment was about. The people that were mentally fatigued also rated their perceived exertion much higher than those who were not mentally fatigued. So I tell you these studies to just provide evidence that when you are tired, perhaps you're not physically tired, and perhaps you can dig deep in order to push further. Guys, I recognize this is much easier said than done. It's very nice sitting in my air-conditioned studio telling you about pushing through when you don't feel like running, but I know that when I get out there in the heat and I start running and I'm running for a long time, it gets a bit harder. It can definitely be a challenge. But guys, you and I, we can do hard things. So let me know. I want to know about your experience with doing hard things. I want to know about your experience in pushing through when you didn't think you could. Maybe it's in a race, Maybe it's in a training environment. Maybe it's after not getting sleep. I don't know. You tell me. Well, guys, I had a pretty good week of running. I mean, not the best week. My plantar fasciitis is still a pain in my foot, but good enough. I'm happy with it. My week started off on Monday with 7.3 miles, very easy. And even though I took an extra day off last week, for some reason Monday always feels a little more difficult than some of my other runs, even though I always run very easy on Mondays. By Tuesday I was back to normal. Felt pretty good, ready to put in the speed work. I ran a total of 8.5 miles that day. Started off with a warm-up of 2 miles, then I knocked out 12 400-meter repeats with 400 meters recovery in between. And because I had to hustle to get to work, I only had time for a half a mile cool down. Well, I say half a mile cool down, that was half a mile of running cool down. I then walked around for a bit. So as far as cool downs go, I think that was pretty good. I was pretty proud of myself. Now Wednesday was another easy day, knocked out 11 miles total. And I gotta say, the 11 miles was a very easy run because my legs were tired, more tired than I would expect from those 400s the day before. But still, I finished those 11 miles feeling pretty good, which was good because Thursday was another workout day. Now Thursday I went out and I ran 3 miles to warm up and then a 10K at tempo pace, and then I cooled down for a mile. And I was actually pretty happy with running a 10K at tempo pace because I started out feeling like I'll probably only do 4 miles, then it was 5 miles, then I started talking myself into doing 5.5 miles, and eventually 10K. It doesn't always work that way. It's usually the other way around where I'm negotiating down. Friday was my day off. Saturday was my long run of the week. Now this is my busy work week and it was only 14 miles. And even though it was only 14 miles, because I'm punching the clock, I'm out just after 3 in the morning to get this run in before going to work. It's always just a bit of a challenge, you know what I mean? My body definitely hasn't had time to warm up, to soak in the coffee, and it always feels like a bit of a forced effort, but still, got it done. And then I wrapped up the week with 7.5 miles, super easy. I did run over to the mall and I ran up and down the car park, but aside from those very minor hills, it was a very easy run. Bringing my week's total to 58.6 miles, which is about 94.3 kilometers. So all in all, pretty good week. All right, my friends, that's it for today. Be kind, be happy, run well. See you in a couple of days.